Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everybody. Welcome to our 48th webinar. Today we have Stefano Demiliani as our guest, talking about how to work with files in BC SaaS, a topic that arose at a customer meeting some months ago. And typically I'm not an expert at this, and I knew Stefano knew much more about it. So I'm very happy that he agreed to do this webinar, and seeing the lot of people that have joined, this is typically a topic that more people are interested in. So Stefano, we're very happy to have you over. Before I'm going to hand over to you, a couple of housekeeping rules as you're accustomed to. Your microphone is muted. Please, if you do have questions, post them in the question window, and I, Luc van Vugt, the moderator of today, will pick them up and post them to Stefano. We agreed that will be at the end of the session, although Stefano might decide in between, okay, there's room for questions. I'm going to pick them up surely at the end. Recording will be on YouTube. We're moving up to the 700 people already subscribed to YouTube. You will find it there, of course. I'll hope to get it there this evening. And of course, if you want to be in the know, subscribe to our newsletter. Topic of today, which Stefano will discuss, is on the first slide about files and SaaS, something I need to learn about too. It actually was triggered by a customer that I was teaching on AL, and they were asking about how do we handle files. I know a little bit, but I know some guy who knows much more. So that's why we have you over here today, Stefano. So what's next? 2 other webinars have been already planned, scheduled. One will be in 2 weeks' time by Tobias, and another one in 4 weeks' time by Bert. And I'm working on 2 others already, so there's more to come. Keep yourself in the know by subscribing to the newsletter, following us on Twitter, and of course, any other topics you want to bring in, please do so. Feel free to bring in topics, suggest topics, but also use this opportunity, this channel, to be a speaker also. There's no perfectness on this. The most important part is to be sharing stories. What do you know? What could others take profit on? Because we're all listening to others, but we could also contribute to others. So be welcome to suggest anything. Now, standard slide before I'm going to hand over to you, Stefano. Thanks to ForNav sponsoring us by providing GoToWebinar every time again. So I'm finished with my part. I'm going to make you presenter right now, Stefano. So feel free to to share your screen. And then
Hi, Luc. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
I will share my screen quickly.
And it's there, yeah, and you're loud and clear, so I reckon that we're set to go.
Can you see this, the first slide? Can you confirm this?
Yeah, it's there.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to everyone. In this webcast, thanks to the Europa webinar, we will talk about working with files, especially with Business Central SaaS, and we'll see how you can handle different scenarios by using files in the cloud environment. Very quickly, the agenda of that I prepared for today is first an introduction of the basic of file management with the IL language, so how you can normally handle files with the IL language. And then we will start seeing some of new features available and new type of integration available with files. That requires, for example, OneDrive, that requires using Azure storage from the IL language, and also interacting with the FTP from a cloud environment. So these are the macro topics that I prepared for this session. To start, as an introduction, I think that you know this diagram. This diagram shows the on-premise versus SaaS architecture differences. And why we are talking about files today, files seems a very basic concept, but with the movement to the cloud, it's become a quite complex task to manage, because when you was on premise, all was managed inside your Azure infrastructure, inside your network infrastructure. So you are responsible for managing all the stack of your infrastructure that starts from the networking and spans on top to the application. So files was inside your normally Azure, your corporate network, and it's quite easy from Business Central on-premise to handle files inside your corporate network. But moving the application to a software as a service application, this means that you don't manage nothing about these layers. These layers are all abstract to you and are all managed by the platform itself. So in this case, by the hoster provider, that's Microsoft. And you don't have access from a SaaS application to what is hosted into your corporate network. So files with Business Central SaaS are quite an important topic and quite a complex topic to manage. And the difference that with Business Central on-premise, in your corporate network, there's all. So you install Business Central inside your corporate network. You install the underlying layer, so the database inside your corporate network. And the storage, file storage, and something like that are inside your corporate network. And if you have an extension that targets the on-premise world, you can directly access the file system because it's hosted into your infrastructure. But when moving to the cloud, this is different because Business Central now runs as a service into a cloud service. And the corporate network is instead in your local area network. And without nothing, Business Central is not able to access a file that is inside your corporate network simply because it doesn't know that your corporate network exists. So how we can use files? If you are on premise, you have normally full access to local resources simply because an extension that targets the on-premise world can access exactly like in the old NIV era all the local resources that are in your local network. But if instead you are on a cloud environment, so a SaaS environment, you have no access to local resources simply because the cloud doesn't see your local resources. And when you create an extension with Visual Studio Code and the IL language, and you start a new extension project, the default is that the extension targets the cloud world. And normally in the app.json file, you have target cloud. Implicitly, you have target cloud. So you don't have target because implicitly it's target cloud. But you can, if you want to force your extension to be executable only in your on-premise environment, you can set, for example, target on-prem. This is absolutely a worst practice. I don't absolutely recommend to use target on-prem in your extension because Microsoft doesn't want you to push extension that simply works in your premise. Please remember also the Universal Code Initiative that I talked about it also in some blog posts in the past. And you will pay some fees if you have extension that has target on premise. So here the goal is to leave the extension targeting the cloud world because it's the reference model for your development purpose. And if you use target cloud, you immediately see that you cannot use some of the file operations that normally you can use in an on-premise world. So, for example, if you use, if you try to do file copy, you have immediately an error thrown by Visual Studio Code saying that the application object copy has scope on premise, and so you cannot use it for extension development. The same is so if you use some methods of the file management code unit. File management code unit is an abstract layer on top of the file management features, and if you use some methods of these code units, like for example copy client file, that is the method that permits you to copy a file that is in the client, runs in the client, you have an error saying that this method cannot be executed in a cloud extension. So obviously, if you set target on-prem, you are available that. But as I said before, we don't want to set target on-prem because our extension must be executable in both worlds. So saying that, when talking about file usage on SaaS, there's an important concept to remember, and this is the basic of the file management with AI language, and this is the concept of streaming. Streaming is an important concept normally in every programming language, and with the streaming permits you to access binary data stored in objects, for example, blobs, without considering the actual representation of the object. So it's an abstract layer between you and the object. And in Business Central, you have in the AI language, you have the in-stream object, input acronym of input stream, and you have the outstream object, output stream, that permits you to have some generic stream objects that you can use in order to read from a file or write data to a file. And in particular, the in-stream data type can be used to read bytes from a stream, and the outstream permits you to write bytes to a stream. And then Business Central also offers the 10 blob code unit is an abstract layer that can be used to convert between these two data types. So in the first, I will move directly in this first part with showing how you can use the basic file management features in the AI language directly with code, because I think that is quite more effective. So let me just open Visual Studio Code, and here I simply created some example in order how to use. For example, I created here a table. Let me maybe zoom in a bit. There's a table here. This table has is a table that is storing files, and is an ID, and is a content, and the content is a blob file. The goal here is to read and write data into this blob file from a file. And for that, AI language, as said before, offers the streams object. So if you want to upload a file from the client to a blob field, you can use these two objects, the in-stream object and the outstream objects. And you can use a method of the file object called upload into stream that permits you to retrieve a file from the client, retrieve the path file from the client, save that file into the in-stream object, and then when the binary is ready into the in-stream, you can create an outstream from the blob field. So this is the blob field of my table. As defined is my table. Content is the blob field of my table. From the blob field, you can create an outstream that reads data. And with copy stream method, you can copy the in-stream binary data to the outstream. And this data flows directly from the binary data that comes into the in-stream into the blob field. And in this way, I'm inserting a file. So quite easy. You are reading a file from the client and then insert it into a blob. The same, quite the same, is for downloading. So if I now uploaded a file into my blob field, and now I want to extract that file from my blob field to the client. To do that, you need to retrieve the record that contains the blob. The blob, remember, that is in order to be available from AI language, you need to use cal fields. So in this way, I'm calculating the blob content. So the engine returns the blob content. Now from the blob file, the blob field, I use the create in-stream method in this now that permits you to have an in-stream object in order to read the binary data from the blob field. And then when the in-stream is filled with the binary data, I can use the download from stream method of the file object in order to pass the in-stream to the file, to the client. This way, the user is prompted to download the file. One of the limitations of this solution is that here you are working with a blob field and this blob field is inside a particular table. So inside your custom table, the SDFiles is my custom table. And sometimes if you store large blobs into a tables where you have records and where you do also business process is not the best solution for the world. So you can have performance problems or something like that. So we'll see later a possible solutions. The outstream object is also useful in order to write the content to a file. In this method, for example, I'm retrieving an item record, and I want to create a file, for example, a text file, that contains some details of the item record, the current item record. To do that, I can use the outstream object. So I'm retrieving the record in input. With the Blob code unit, I created the outstream. This creates a generic outstream. With the outstream, I can use some methods like write text, where I can write into the outstream the content that I want. For example, yeah, I'm passing the item number, the description, and other details that you want. And then, same as before, I need when the outstream is filled with the data that I want to export as a file, I create an in-stream by using the Blob code unit. So I create a generic in-stream, and then I download it from stream, this in-stream. And the file is directly downloaded for you. Use it in Blob, create outstream and create in-stream, creates for you an abstract layer that permits you to have a channel for streaming binary data from the server to the client. As said before, the example before saves a Blob file into a Blob field, into a particular table. In my case, my business table. SFTP is my business table. But sometimes you don't want that. Imagine that you want to store files attached to, I don't know, an invoice, for example, or a custom entity that you handle in your project. And inside this custom entity, you do also business processes like filtering, like analysis, and something like that. Having a Blob fields contributes you to enlarge the size of the table and reduces the performances of the table. So sometimes it's much better to have blobs stored outside of this table. And for that, Business Central now has an abstraction layer called persistent blob, and that is mapped under the hood into a table. If you check in the base application, you have a table called persistent blob, but for you is mapped under the hood. And you can use a code unit called persistent blob in order to save a blob from a file to this system table. And this permits you to save a file into an external table, so the persistent blob table permits you to have retrieve a persistent ID that is the ID of your file stored in external table. So into your business table, for example, the invoice or your custom table, you don't store physically the blob, but you store the ID of the blob into the persistent blob table. To do that, you can use, for example, a method like this. I call it import blob to persistent blob. Sorry for the name. That uses the persistent blob code unit and an in-stream object. And this object will upload into stream. I'm loading the file from the client. I loaded the file into the in-stream. Then I create a persistent blob. The creation of the persistent blob returns a big integer that is the persistent blob ID, the ID of the file that will be saved into that table. And with this method, persistent blob dot copy from in-stream, you can save the in-stream into the persistent blob table. And you can then save the persistent ID into your business table, for example, in order to retrieve the file. So the file is saved into another table called persistent blob table that has a particular management under the hood. And your business table, like sales invoice or my custom tables, are not affected by having blob fields inside the table. Also, if I want to attach blobs to every record, the opposite way is that when you want to return, so I have the persistent file ID, or also the file name. And I want, given that ID, I want to go into the persistent blob table and downloading the file. To do that, the persistent blob code unit has method also for do that. You can do a call to the exist method by passing the persistent ID and doing persistent blob code unit dot exist persistent ID. You can, if it's true, this means that the code unit has found the file. Then you can read the file by using the create outstream method. This fills the outstream objects. Then you can using persistent blob dot copy to outstream, and this takes the file, fills the outstream. Then you can create the in-stream, and then you can download the file. So you have handle exactly like in the first scenario I show, where I directly save the file into the blob field and then download the file from the blob field. But in this case, the file is not directly saved into the blob field, but into the persistent blob table. And this does not affect performances on my business table, for example. Other things that you can do with files with the standard AI language features. For example, you can save a report as a PDF by always using the streams objects. For example, here I'm creating a stream object, generic stream. I'm looping through customers, and then I'm calling a report. The save as method of the report function that wants a number of the report to execute, the format of the report, and report save as now, if used on SaaS, as some parameter, requires some parameter. For example, the outstream and the record ref to pass. So in this case, I'm retrieving the customer as a record ref. The customer has filters. I'm calling the report. I'm filling the outstream. And then you can use file management.blob export in order to export the file, for example. And you can also attach the PDF to a mail by using the new email message code unit that creates a message. And then with the temp-blob.create in stream, you read the stream, and then you can add this stream as attachment. And also the add attachment, if used on SaaS, wants the in-stream object. So quite small difference with the on-premise, where you can directly pass the file. Here you need to pass the in-stream in order to be able to use that as a SaaS. But you can also, from SaaS, save this file as a PDF and attach that to an email, for example, or save that in the blob field or something like that. Other scenarios, you can call XML port and render the output of the download the output of this XML port to the client. In this example, I've used the standard export on contact XML port, where you can to use that you need to create an outstream with, for example, also an encoding. You call the export method of the XML port, and before that, you need the XML port as a method called set destination, where you can pass the outstream. And this means that this XML port, the output will be sent to an outstream. Then, with the same method as before, third time that used, called the temp-blob.create in stream, you can take the in-stream, fill the in-stream, and then download it to the client. What happens if you execute this method? The XML port is executed, its output is rendered to a stream object, and this stream object is sent to the client. And you have a file called content list.txt that contains the output of the XML port. Other scenarios that you can use with AI language is, for example, importing item pictures. For importing item picture, the item picture is a field with type media set. And to do that, you read the item picture from the outside, upload into stream. And then you use the media set field as a method called import stream, where passing the in-stream and the file name, you can import the content to the media set field, quite same as the blob. You can also export the item picture. And to export the item picture, for example, here I create a method to export the item picture, but in a bulk mode. I want to create the export the item picture and then create a zip file. To do that, you need to always create an outstream. You need to use the data compression code unit in order to create a zip archive. Then here I'm looping through the item picture, because item picture can be more than one. So remember that item picture is the media set field with the count method, because you can upload more than one. The item picture are inside the tenant media table. So you need to retrieve the item picture in this way by doing a get with the item.picture.item with the index of the item picture, simply because picture is a media set field that can contain more than one. It's like an array. So you can do the calculation of the content of the item picture, and then if the content has a value, you can create an stream and add the stream to the zip file. So I use the data compression code unit that has an add entry method that permits you to save the stream to a zip file. Then the zip is closed, and then you can pass to the client by using the usual method and blob.creating stream and pass it to the client. Same also is for JSON. Very quickly, for JSON, if you want to have read and write JSON, you can use JSON objects and JSON tokens. You can create here, for example, I want to extract a JSON. You can create a JSON object. I create a token. I'm reading a blob into the file content. I want to pass the file content into a JSON, and in order to pass the file content into a JSON, you need to convert it into base 64. So here I'm reading the content. I'm creating a tag that is the base 64 convert of this code unit dot to base 64. Remember, if you this is useful if you want, for example, to use APIs or something like that in order to pass blobs. You need to convert it to JSON. And the same is for uploading from JSON. You can read a JSON, have a JSON in input, and if the JSON pass to you a blob, you need to remember to read the JSON token that contains the blob. The blob must be is a JSON, is a base 64 of the binary data. So you need to create an outstream of the field where you want to store the blob, and then you need to do the opposite. So base 64 convert dot from base 64, and it's the method that converts the outstream binary data reading from base 64 data reading into a binary data that you can write into the blob field. So quite useful, the JSON, if you want to use with APIs that interacts with the JSON data. So this is all about related features that the IL language has in order to handle files. Streams are absolutely important. And you have remember that you can save file into blob fields, but also into tenant media tables as media set, and also into the persistent blob table if you want to store into an external table and save only the ID into your record. And I recommend, honestly, this approach. Now we see something more. So we have seen how to handle files with basic IL language, but please remember that storing files into Business Central is something that you should be carefully evaluate, simply because I think that you remember this slide, because it was presented, I think, quite 1 year ago. Business Central in SaaS, in Business Central SaaS, you pay for the storage. And Business Central SaaS has 80 gigabytes as a base entitlement for storage for environments, for every environment. And now you have also some storage for user and additional storage capacity that you can acquire if you go out of storage. This is simply to say that normally in the cloud, the storage has a cost. And if you start storing a lot of Blob fields into your Business Central environment, you can go over the storage capacity, and you can also affect performances of your entire environment. So in the cloud, you can also start thinking on storing files outside of the Business Central environment. And what does that mean, of storing outside of the Business Central environment? Essentially, it means that you can use cloud storage, some cloud storages, in order to store your files. And what offers Business Central at the moment for storing cloud files into a cloud environment? As a first step, you have now OneDrive integrations. OneDrive, essentially OneDrive for Business, is a cloud storage service included in your Microsoft 365 subscription. And the Business Central now has an integration with OneDrive for Business and permits you to store, manage, and share files with other people using OneDrive. And when a file is stored into OneDrive, you have also a set of collaborative features typical of the OneDrive, like, for example, editing in Excel or in Word or in PowerPoint or something like that. So it's quite interesting in order to do that. And the standard feature is of opening with using OneDrive is related to actually in the product is related to the attached. When you attach a document, a file to, for example, an entity or like a customer or like an invoice, you can also open in OneDrive this file. And when you use, you have now this action called Open in OneDrive. And when you use this action, what happens into the OneDrive? It happens that the first time that you call this action, OneDrive creates a folder into name Business Central. In this Business Central folder, creates another folder with the same name as your company you are working on. So you can have more than one, and puts a copy of the file, of the selected file, into that folder, and the file is opened. When every time you open a file, the file will only copied and opened. So no, we don't have obviously folder creations. The experience is that you can open the file into OneDrive. The file is copied to OneDrive. You can directly open, you can share it. And remember that the folder and the content is normally private to you until you decide to share the file with others. So the file is normally private to you. You can, if you want to share, you need to share the file with others. In order to access OneDrive, you need to go into the My Settings page. And you need to choose the link of the cloud storage field where you can select your OneDrive. This is what offers the standard product, but you can also do more. Business Central 20, the next release, permits you to do something more. So, for example, you can create, and later we'll see how, you can create custom buttons, like, for example, here in the post-experience invoice, I want to have an opening OneDrive button that, when called, sends a PDF or that invoice to OneDrive, for example. And you can also have features like if the file is already exists, OneDrive asks you to what you want to do, if you want to keep both copies or if you want to overwrite. If you want to overwrite, the file is overwritten. Otherwise, if you want to keep both, OneDrive takes a duplication of the file. And later we see how you can use the Business Central 20 offers some co-units to do that. And later we see an example. The other possibility is to use the Azure storage. And honestly is what I prefer as a general layer of storing files. The Azure storage is under the Azure storage family. There are a set of possibility to store files. Azure Blobs, Azure Files, Azure Queues, and Azure Tables. We will talk today only about blobs and files because they're more relevant to what I think everyone of you talks about files. Azure Blobs, as first, is a simple storage abstraction that you can use to store unstructured data, so blobs. Azure Blobs is the first way of possibility of storing files into the cloud. It's unstructured, so don't see Azure Blobs like a file system. In Azure Blobs, you cannot create folder or something like that. You can simply store blobs, and when the blob is stored, it's in the cloud, and then you can download your blob. So it's like a repository for blob files. When you declare a blob, an Azure Blob storage account, you have a storage. You need to declare a storage account. Inside the storage account, you need to create containers, and containers are like container of blobs. And then inside the blobs, you have your physical blob. A container contains a set of blobs, and you can normally organize your blobs into more than one container into a particular storage account. And you can have unlimited number of containers inside the storage account. When your file is saved into the cloud, so from Business Central, you save a file into the blob storage. Normally, you want also sometimes to copy the files to the file system. And to do that, there are different ways. One of the easy way is to use Power Automate for that. And from Power Automate, you have a standard template where you can, that is called copy files from Azure Blob Storage to file system. And this template, if you create a workflow for this, simply ask you what is the Azure Blob Storage to monitor. And it asks you for a connection to configure a file system action. What does this action? You want to copy a file from Azure to your client, and your client is in your corporate network. And as said before, your corporate network cannot be visible to the client. So what happens when you use this action? This action permits you, ask you to set a connection, authentication with your local machine, and it prompts you to download a gateway. A gateway, simply install it, is the gateway between the client, the cloud, and your client. And the gateway is needed in order if you want to transfer automatically the file from the blob storage to the client. And what happens is that when Business Central saves a file to the blob storage, and later we'll see how to do that, the file is immediately transferred to the file system of the client or where you want. This is by using blob storage. The other possible way is using Azure File Share. Azure File Share is instead specifically a file system in the cloud. So Azure File Share is like an Azure Blob Storage, so often you have an REST API where you want to call, but now it's a real file system. So whereas it supports this SMB protocol, so that means that you can mount an Azure File Share on Windows, on Linux, or on Mac or Mac OS as a drive, as a physical drive, like having a Z drive or D drive. And you can also use a tool like Azure File Sync in order to cache file shares from cloud to on-premise server or vice versa, in order to have the files in place. Azure Files, as I said before, can be deployed into two ways. The first is using Azure File Share and map it as a network drive. The second is using Azure File Sync, as it is a tool that permits you to map, to sync the local files to the cloud files. And in Azure File Share, you can also have backups of your file, so snapshot of your file. You can have up to 200 snapshots per file share, and you can retain files for up to 10 years. So you can also have the complete backup and storage of your files. And file shares, if you use file shares, normally you have 4 different tiers of storage. You can use premium tier. Premium tier is means that your files are uses SSD disks. So you have high performance and low latency for accessing files. You can have what is called a transaction optimized storage tier that is normally for if you have small files and with the frequent access is useful for that. And then you can have other 2 tiers, so-called hot and cold, that are normally general purpose file sharing, and this uses HDD technologies, and normally are the 2 tiers that has a low cost. When you use Azure File Share, you normally, the first question that Azure File Share asks to you is how you can create the file share. And normally the question that you need to follow are 3. What type of performance do you require? So if you require SSD disk or HDD disk, if you require high performance, go to premium. If you don't require so much performance because you sometimes use files, use the hot and cold tier that is based on HDD. If you require redundancy, remember that the premium tier only supports zone redundant and local redundant. So premium tier does not support geo redundancy. So according to the redundancy that you want, you need to select the right tier. And what size of file you want to store into a single file storage account. Because file shares can span into 100 terabytes, but if you use geo-redundant, you are limited to 5 terabytes. So saying that, what you can do with the file share is that from Business Central, you can save a file into the file share. The file share supports folders, support exactly like a file system, and you can map directly this into a folder in your local network. So your user can see a network folder like a share, like a network share, but this network share under the hood is in the cloud. But when the file can be saved from the user, for example, from drag and drop to the share folder in here, the file is automatically mapped to the file share and Business Central can see it, or vice versa. Mapping to local OneDrive is quite easy. You can simply, when you have created the file share, you select your file share, and then from the Azure portal, you can click connect. And when you can click connect, the connect button, it prompts you to map a drive letter, and it gives you a script that you need to execute in the local client in order to map this drive to this folder in Azure. And for the user, is exactly like a standard drive. The other possibility is a script. You do that only from script. I don't want to go into details of the script. I've shared the script in the past in one of my blog posts. So you can find the script into my GitHub repo. And what happens if you execute this script? If you execute the script, it creates a file share automatically. It maps this file share into a network drive, and your user has a network drive to use. Sorry, wrong slide, but the slide was this wrong order. But you can have a network drive where you can put file or read file from, and this file under the hood is the network. So, very quick demo about how to use these features from the IL language. The first is OneDrive. OneDrive, in Business Central 20, you have, here I've placed a button into the post-sales invoice called Opening OneDrive. And in Business Central 20, you have the Document Service Management Code Unit. And this code unit handles the OneDrive integration. So for example, here, what I want to do here is save into OneDrive automatically when the user click the Open OneDrive button, save the PDF of the file of this invoice, and permits me to share it with other users. So you can, here I created a function called Get Invoice PDF that simply retrieves my record and calls the method of the report selections called the get PDF report forecast that takes the invoice and with parameters, and it gives my PDF report. This PDF report is saved into the Blob. Then I create the stream, and then here it comes the new code unit available in Business Central 20 for handling OneDrive interaction. So I calling the document service management code unit, and I call the opening OneDrive method. The opening OneDrive method wants a file name, a file extension, and the in stream of the file that you want to store and open in OneDrive. In this case, I'm saving into my OneDrive for business the PDF on the invoice, and then I can, from OneDrive, I can share to my colleagues or something like that. So quite easy. And you can also do here, if you have a media set, I've commented here because I don't have a media set here, but if you have an attachment, you want to save an attachment into OneDrive, remember that you need to pass the media set ID. You can call the method opening OneDrive from media, and this takes the media set and save, and wants the name of the file, the extension, and then the ID of the file. With this simple call, you can save your file to OneDrive and share, and then share with your user. The other is instead the blob storage interaction. So blob storage, Business Central now has support for blob storage. So you have a code unit called Azure Blob Storage, all the code unit contains the word ABS, and you have an interface in order to handle the authorization of your storage. And then the storage now is very easy. To show that what happens, I created here a storage account. I created my storage account here as some access key. You need to take in order to interact from Business Central, you need to copy this key from your storage account. You create a storage account and copy this key. And then from Business Central, you can do all. You pass this key here. And then, for example, here I want my extension creates a container, a blob container. So first is you call storage service authorization, that is this code unit, dot create shared key. This code unit, as you can see here, wants a shared key of the storage account, and returns an interface called authorization. When I have the authorization, I can call container client. Container client is the ABS container client code unit. That's called initialize the container. Here I create the container into the blob storage. Then you can, when the container is created, you can do what you want. For example, here I show all the possibilities. So I can list the containers. So these methods retrieves the list of the container, and then I can loop to the list and say all the containers that I have in my storage account. I can save a file. To save a file, for example, you need to first call the IBS blob client code unit and call the initialize method by passing the storage account and the container. And then you can use one of the methods. For example, put blob text is the method that saves a text blob content, but you can also have other methods like put here not, but you also have other method for save file, like from stream, from text, and so on. You have in this way you can save a file into the blob storage, and this file stays into the blob storage. And then, for example, I can retrieve the file. I can list my blob, my container, and then I can retrieve the files. Very easy. So if just very, very quickly to show the execution, because we are running quite out of time. Very quickly, I have, if I log to my local environment, sorry. I can very quickly show what happens. Totally transparent for you under the hood, so no APIs, no nothing. Here I have my storage account. If I go into containers, in this storage account, I have only one container called BC Blobs that I use from another application to store blobs from Business Central. But in my code, as said before, my code creates a container called my container and saves a file that contains this. If I execute this method, blob storage demo, what does this method? It connects to my storage account. It first lists my blobs. So it lists that I have this container, and now this container, because it's created a container, it creates a blob file. It creates the content of the blob, and finish. If I check my storage account now, you can see that I have a container, new container created, and inside the container, I have the blob. So from Business Central, I save the file into a container, into a blob, and then I can also download and if this is mapped to a network drive, the user can directly see it as a network, as a drive, as something like that. So, or directly do what you want. So it's quite easy. I use it as a blob storage that is cheaper and performant. All from AI code. Now, last part. Lots of people asked about interaction with the FTP from SaaS. And FTP from SaaS means two ways. First is I have an FTP server. I want to pass this file from the FTP to Business Central. And from SaaS, obviously, you can interact directly with an FTP server because you cannot use .NET, you cannot use that. And so the trick is to use something like Logic Apps, for example. And to do that, you can create a workflow with Logic Apps that uses the FTP connector. And when you select the FTP connector, you can select when a file is added or modified. It asks you to set the FTP connection to your FTP server that you want to monitor. And when a file is added to this folder into the FTP server, you can also specify how often you need to check for new items. When the file is added, you need to define the actions when you want to execute when the file is added or modified to the FTP. And what you want to do is to read the file content. So you select the get file metadata action. In the get file metadata, you need to fill the file parameter. And the file parameter, you need to take the list of files ID. That means that I want to retrieve the file ID that this connector retrieves as a file loaded. And when the file is loaded, you need to read the file content from the select the get file content action. And in the get file content, in the file parameter, select the ID of the file. So this action will retrieve the file content or the file ID passed as input. So it monitors the FTP. When a file is added to the FTP, it retrieves the file. And then when the file is retrieved, you can, for example, save it into the blob storage. You can create a blob into the blob storage. And when you create a blob, simply select the blob storage where you want to store the file, add the blob name and blob content but from the first action, like in this way. And your file is from the FTP, is automatically saved into the blob storage. And when saved into the blob storage, you can directly read it from Business Central, as said before, from the AI code. You can see the list of files and read the files. So very easy. You can also do more. but I don't want to spend too much time on this. You can also do, there are often requirements of parsing the files or processing the file, maybe from an FTP server to, before saving it into Business Central. Imagine to have an electronic invoice or something like that. If you do that, I recommend to use Azure Functions for this. And you can, when the blob is saved into the storage account, you can call an Azure function. Your Azure function can receive the file and process the file, and then you can call, for example, Business Central APIs, like in this way, where I retrieving. This is a blob trigger Azure function, and handle the files and calls the files, save the files. So good performance, but it's only for processing. If you don't want to process a particular file, out of the box, you have the feature for saving the file to a blob storage, and then from Business Central, poor AI code, read them. The opposite is from Business Central, I want to save a file directly into an FTP server. As said before, you cannot do that directly. And to do that, you have two ways. The first is using Azure Functions, and the second is using Logic Apps. Now here I want to use Logic Apps because it's a more quick way, and it's a low-code way. So to do that, you can, for example, save the file from Business Central to the blob storage, as said before in the AI code, and then create a Logic Apps that starts from a blob storage. So when the file is added or modified into the blob storage, get the blob content of this file, and then call the FTP connector or SFTP if you want to use the secure FTP. And this connector, you can select the create file action, fill the parameters of the action of the FTP server where you want to pass the file. And then in the create file action, you simply need to put the output of the blob content. So the file name is the display name that comes from the blob content, and the file content is the file content that comes from this action. Simply, in a totally drag and drop way, you have moved the file from your Business Central to the blob storage, and then from the blob storage to the FTP server. So very easy, very quick. Please, last slide, please also remember that if you use cloud storage, it's I recommend always to monitor the cloud storage, and cloud storage supports monitoring. Simply, you need to enable the diagnostic settings, and in diagnostic settings, you can select first status must be on of the diagnostic, and when on, you can select what type of metrics you want to monitor in order to, for example, to monitor how your user uses the files, how frequently access the files, how frequently delete, in order also to know if you are using the right type of storage or not, because you can also maybe select to switch to another type of storage. So monitoring is always quite important to monitor. So I've finished the questions. I'm bits later, sorry for that, but contents were a lot.
We've got 30 seconds, but it was loud and clear, I get, in my opinion. There is one question, let's pick that up. And I think you indeed answered the questions from Adrian, which I will read out loud maybe also. Let's take a couple of minutes more just to pick a couple of things. Question that's here on the question window is from Frederic Gourand. What about working with SharePoint? I hope that Microsoft already had some standard integration available, as is it's widely used. SharePoint. A typical question is to store documents per customer, etc., preferably with drag and drop solution. Is there in this way a good, or simple way to work with SharePoint?
SharePoint is obviously a good possibility of storing files. At the moment, there's not an out-of-the-box an easy way from Microsoft Connector in order to use SharePoint. So you can absolutely use SharePoint and upload files to SharePoint, but recommendation is to use REST APIs from SharePoint. You can SharePoint exposes some APIs where you can pass the files and save this file into into a SharePoint list, for example. Or better, the personal approach that I use with SharePoint is, for example, having an Azure function that handles takes some files from Business Central, simple REST calls that from Business Central takes a JSON file, a JSON object that contains the file content. The Azure function then connects to SharePoint and handle the connection to the file saving to the SharePoint list. But an easy integration like the actual integration with OneDrive, I agree that should be done.
Yeah.
But
do you know if it's on the roadmap somehow?
There are third-party extensions to do that. A very good third-party extension. I don't want to recommend somehow in particular, but there are good third-party extensions that work on that. But Microsoft has not now a roadmap for improving the SharePoint integration. So
okay, clear. A compliment from Bente. It was a great demo. Thanks for that answer, by the way. I have a couple of small questions.
Unfortunately, we have a small time in order to do more demos. So my goal was to give you the messages in order to show all the possibilities.
And that was very clear. One main question, the AL code you have, will that be shareable?
Yes, absolutely, yes.
Yep. So
yes.
if you can send that to me or whatever link you have for that. And a last question I do have is Azure Blob storage versus Azure file storage or file share. Is there a cost in that to choose for one or the other?
Yes, the Azure Blob storage has a cost, but the cost of the Azure Blob storage is very, very small. So I absolutely recommend, if you plan to store files, I absolutely recommend the Blob storage because it's a very cheap way. So for very less than 10 euros, you can pay, you can store a very large amount of files. So it's much more cheaper than storing files into Business Central and risking or going out of the storage. Azure Blob Storage has a small cost than the Azure File Share, but Azure File Share is required if you really want to have a complete file system in the cloud.
Okay.
So mappables also with local drives. If you don't need that, Azure Blob Storage is a good way.
Yeah, clear. We took a little bit more of the time. A last remark from Xavier. Also an excellent presentation, Stefano. Thank you very much for this. It perfectly fit my goal for today. I hope it did for others. We had a lot of attendees, more than 90, so a lot of interest, and most of them stayed towards the end. So I think that's a compliment to you, Stefano. So thanks once more. Thanks for everybody being here.
Thanks to everyone.
Yeah. Have a good evening, remaining part of the day, and we might meet in 2 weeks' time again. I will upload this probably somewhere this evening, and you will be able to replay it or share it with others. Thank you very much, Stefano.
Thank you very much to everyone.
Bye for now.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.